Mei Lin caught the falling ridge beam, the one that would have crushed the boy, and held it on her shoulders until the world stopped shaking. If this story moves you, do me a kindness before we go any further. Subscribe to the channel, follow it all the way to the end, because the part that will stay with you comes late, and leave the name of your town down in the comments so we can all watch together how far this story travels. Now let me carry you back to where it truly began. She arrived at the end of the line, where the stagecoach deposited her in a cloud of alkali dust and then turned back towards civilization. She carried one canvas satchel holding two poplin shirts, a change of underthings, a whetstone, and a small, heavy purse containing the sum of her life. She stood for a long moment, letting the dust settle on her plain, dark bombazine dress. The sun was a hammer in the brassy sky, and the land stretched out before her, broken and thirsty. Mei Lin was a large woman. It was the first thing people saw, the thing they never forgot, her bigness, her color, her too-muchness. In the cities of the coast, she had learned that such a body was a vessel for the assumptions of others. Too big to be delicate, too strong to be feminine, too plain to be of interest. She had learned to build a fortress behind her face, to keep her features still and her eyes quiet, a defense against the thousand small cuts of being looked at but not seen. She had learned that her competence was a threat and her silence a mercy to those who would otherwise feel small in her presence. She had learned to expect to be discarded when her usefulness was at an end. This fortress was old, its stones worn smooth by a lifetime of lonely resilience. She walked away from the road, following the faintest hint of wagon ruts toward a low-slung shape on the horizon that might have been a homestead. The land talked, and over the years she had learned its language. It spoke to her now in a dialect of neglect and sorrow. It spoke in the sag of the barbed wire, its posts leaning like tired old men. It spoke in the choke of thistle and burr in the ditches meant to carry water. It spoke in the silence where there should have been the lowing of healthy cattle, a silence that felt like a held breath. She could read the story of this place in the cracked earth and the splintered wood. It was a story of a heart that had stopped beating. At the homestead, the story became clearer. A house, gray and weathered, with a porch that listed to one side, a barn with one door hanging from a single leather hinge, a dark and gaping mouth, and a man sitting on the porch steps, his shoulders slumped in a way that had nothing to do with labor and everything to do with loss. He was not old, but he was worn to the bone, his face a map of some private grief she did not need to know to understand. He did not look up as she approached, his gaze fixed on the dust between his worn boots. A small face, pale and smudged, watched her from the dark of the doorway behind him, a ghost of a child. Mei Lin stopped a respectful distance away. She did not offer a greeting. Greetings were for neighbors, for equals. She was a traveler, a stranger, a commodity. She waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the whine of the wind through the eaves. Finally she spoke, her voice low and even, not a question but a statement of fact. "Your main irrigation gate is warped," she said. "The posts have shifted in the spring thaw. You are losing a third of your water to the alkali flats." The man's head came up slowly. He looked at her, his eyes a faded blue, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see her. He saw her size, her plain dress, her foreign face. He saw everything the world always saw first. But he had also heard her words. He had heard the truth in them, a truth he had been too tired or too broken to face himself. He squinted as if the sun were in his eyes. "Say that again," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "The gate is warped," she repeated, her face still. "The silt has built up on the east side, pushing the posts out of true. The water you need for the north pasture is draining into the basin. Your cattle are thirsty." He stood up, a slow unfolding of weary limbs. He was tall, but she still met his eye. He looked from her face to the distant line of willows that marked the creek, then back again. He saw no judgment in her eyes, only the calm assessment of a problem. He was a man drowning in problems, and here was one, named and measured. It was a kind of hope he had forgotten existed. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He nodded, a single sharp motion. "The pay is poor." "I will work for my keep and $1 a week," she stated. It was not a negotiation, it was a fact. He nodded again. "I am Silas," he said. "The girl is Elspeth." Mei Lin gave her own name, and the bargain was struck, not with a handshake, but with a shared exhausted understanding of things broken and the faint, terrifying possibility of repair. The next morning, before the sun had burned the chill from the air, Mei Lin was at the creek. She did not ask for tools. She found what she needed in the leaning shed beside the barn: a shovel with a cracked handle, a heavy iron pry bar, a length of rust-pitted chain. She worked with a steady, metronomic rhythm that was the opposite of haste. She dug, she cleared the silt, her shovel slicing into the packed earth with clean, efficient strokes. She used the pry bar and a series of carefully chosen fulcrums to shift the heavy, waterlogged posts, nudging them fractions of an inch at a time back toward true. Silas watched from a distance, mending a harness on the porch. He had expected brute force, a flurry of effort that would soon exhaust itself. Instead, he saw a quiet intelligence, a conversation between muscle and physics. He saw her study the grain of the wood, the flow of the water, the angle of the sun. She was not fighting the land, she was persuading it. By midday, she had the main posts reset. She used the chain and a complex knot he had never seen before to bind them to a deep-set anchor stone, ensuring they would not shift again. The gate, once a sagging wreck, now hung straight and true. When she opened it, the water flowed where it was meant to flow, a clean, dark ribbon cutting through the dry pasture. He said nothing, but that evening, there was a slab of bacon on the table beside the usual beans, and he left a clean tin cup of water on the porch rail where she sat alone, watching the stars come out. It was a wordless acknowledgement. It was enough. The child, Elspeth, was a more difficult puzzle. She was a silent creature of the shadows, flitting from doorway to window, her eyes large and dark in her small face. She never spoke. She watched Mei Lin with a wary, unblinking intensity. Mei Lin did not try to approach her. She knew that a wounded animal must come to you in its own time. So she worked, and as she worked, she would sometimes hum, a low, tuneless sound from a half-forgotten childhood. One afternoon, while carving a new handle for the shovel, a sliver of pine fell to the ground. Mei Lin picked it up and, with a few deft strokes of her pocket knife, shaped it into a rough bird. She did not give it to the child. She left it on the porch step where she knew Elspeth would find it. The next morning it was gone. A few days later, while she was clearing stones from a field, a small, dented tin cup of water appeared on a rock beside her. Elspeth was nowhere to be seen, but the offering was there. Mei Lin drank the water, every drop. That evening, as Mei Lin sat on the porch, the girl came out of the house and sat on the far end of the steps. The little wooden bird clutched in her hand. They sat in silence together as the sky turned from orange to purple, and it was a beginning. The third bastion of the broken homestead was a man named Jedediah. He was the only hired hand Silas had managed to keep, a man as gnarled and weathered as an old mesquite tree. He had one arm, the other lost to a sawmill accident decades ago, and a disposition soured by a lifetime of hardship. He regarded Mei Lin with open suspicion. He saw her as another mouth to feed, another burden on a failing ranch. He called her the woman and gave his orders to Silas as if she were not there. Mei Lin ignored him. She did her work. The test came during a late-season calving. A young heifer, one of Silas's few remaining hopes for rebuilding the herd, was in trouble. The calf was breached and the heifer was weakening. Silas and Jedediah were trying to turn the calf, their faces slick with sweat and strain, but they lacked the leverage. The heifer bellowed, a sound of pure agony. "She's going to die," Jedediah grunted, wiping his good arm across his forehead. "We'll lose them both." Mei Lin stepped forward. "Hold her head," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. Silas looked at her, then nodded. He and Jedediah moved to the heifer's head, trying to soothe her. Mei Lin washed her hands and arms in the bucket of water. She spoke to the animal in a low, steady voice, the same humming tone she used around the child. Then, with a sureness that was breathtaking, she reached inside. Her hands were large, but they were skilled. She found the calf's leg, worked it gently, and with a deep, bracing breath, used her formidable strength not to pull, but to turn. Her whole body was braced, her feet planted in the dirt of the corral. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a great, shuddering sigh from the heifer, the calf shifted. A few moments later, it was born, slick and steaming in the cool air. Jedediah stared, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at the live calf, the exhausted but living mother, and then at Mei Lin. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Hm," he said. "Seen worse." From that day on, he stopped calling her the woman. He called her Lin, and when she pointed to a fence that needed mending, he mended it without a word. The ranch began to breathe again. Under Mei Lin's patient, relentless care, the decay began to reverse itself. Fences were straightened, the barn door was rehung. A small garden fenced against the rabbits began to sprout green shoots near the house. The quiet rhythm of work and repair filled the days. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. And into that peace, one Tuesday afternoon, rolled the polished black buggy of Mr. Abernathy. He was a heavy, soft man, poured into a fine wool suit that seemed out of place in the dust and heat. He was the town banker, the holder of notes, the weaver of financial webs. He moved with the unearned confidence of a man who owned the world, or at least this small, parched corner of it. His face was fixed with a smile that did not touch his eyes, a smile that looked as if it had been set there with a trowel and left to harden. He greeted Silas with a booming warmth that rang false in the quiet air. "Silas, my dear boy, good to see you looking better." His eyes swept the homestead, noting the small improvements, a flicker of something that might have been annoyance crossing his features before the smile was plastered back in place. Then his gaze fell on Mei Lin, who was replacing a rotted board on the porch. He looked her up and down, a slow, appraising glance, the way a man might look at a horse he was considering buying. He turned back to Silas, lowering his voice to a confidential murmur, though it carried clearly to where Mei Lin knelt. "A sturdy specimen you found yourself, Silas. Quite substantial. Good for the heavy work, I imagine." The words landed like stones. Specimen. Substantial. The old language of objectification, of reducing her to her size, her utility. The old armor inside her, the fortress behind her still face, thickened. She did not flinch. She did not look up. She drove a nail into the new board with a single, perfect hammer stroke. She heard Silas's uncomfortable silence, his inability to defend her. She expected nothing less. She had learned long ago not to expect men like Silas to stand against men like Abernathy. Abernathy stayed for an hour, his voice a drone of false sympathy and veiled threats about the notes Silas had outstanding. He spoke of extensions and collateral, of Christian charity and financial reality. When he left, a pall of despair had settled back over the ranch, thicker than the dust from his buggy wheels. That night, Silas sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, a pile of papers and ledgers spread before him. He was a good man, a man of the land, but the language of debt and interest was foreign to him. He was lost in a forest of numbers. "I can't make sense of it," he said, his voice hollow. "Every month I fall further behind. He says he's helping, but it feels like I'm drowning." Mei Lin, who had been cleaning the hearth, rose and came to the table. She stood for a moment, looking at the columns of figures under the flickering lamplight. "My father was a merchant," she said quietly. "He taught me his books. I can read a ledger." Silas looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion and confusion. He saw her, really saw her, and for the first time, he seemed to consider that there was more to her than strength and silence. He hesitated for only a second before pushing the main ledger across the table toward her. "Then read this," he said. "Tell me what it says." For the next 3 nights after the long day's work was done, Mei Lin sat with the books. The numbers spoke to her, another language she understood. They told a story not of misfortune, but of meticulous, predatory design. She traced the lines of credit, the notes sold between suppliers, the compounding interest calculated on schedules that were all but criminal. Abernathy hadn't been helping Silas. He had been hunting him. He had bought up every piece of Silas's debt, consolidating it under the bank's name. The kindness he had shown when Silas's wife, Martha, was sick, paying for the doctor from the city, was not a gift. It was the first link in a chain, a debt secured against the ranch's water rights, with a clause in the fine print so vicious it made her breath catch. On the 4th night, she closed the ledger. She looked at Silas, who was watching her, his hope dwindling with each passing hour. "He isn't your friend," she said, her voice flat with the weight of the truth. "He is a spider, and this ranch is his fly. He means to take it all." She walked him through it, page by page. Her finger, calloused from work, traced the lines of ink. She showed him the inflated fees, the impossible interest. She showed him how every payment he made barely touched the principal, how the debt was designed to grow, not shrink. Silas resisted. The betrayal was too vast, too cruel to comprehend. "No," he said, shaking his head. "He was kind when she passed. He paid for the doctor. He sat with me. A man who did that wouldn't—" Mei Lin turned a page in the ledger. She pointed to a single entry, dated 2 days after the funeral. "The cost of that doctor has been added to this note here," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "With interest compounded daily. He did not give you a gift, Silas. He bought your grief, and now he is selling it back to you at a profit. The contract for the water rights gives him full ownership of the spring if you miss a single payment." The cold, hard fact of the ink on the page broke through his disbelief. The edifice of Abernathy's kindness crumbled, revealing the rotten structure beneath. He looked at the ledger, then at Mei Lin's still patient face. She was not gloating. She was simply showing him the truth. He saw in that moment the depth of her perception, the keenness of a mind he had never bothered to look for. He saw her not as a specimen, not as a hired hand, but as an ally, as a partner. "All right, Mei Lin," he said, and the way he spoke her name was different. It was heavy with respect, with a new and fragile trust. "All right, what do we do?" Their alliance was forged in the quiet lamplight of the kitchen, over columns of damning figures. A quiet war began. They started selling off what little they could spare. A few head of cattle, old farm equipment, to make the next payment, buying themselves time. Mei Lin worked with a fierce, focused energy, pushing the land to yield more, her every action a blow against the closing trap. The crisis, when it came, was not from a man, but from the sky. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, a beast of black cloud and slashing rain. The dry creek, a trickle an hour before, became a raging, muddy torrent. Mei Lin and Silas were working to move the herd to higher ground when they heard the groan of splintering wood. A section of the creek bank, undercut by the flood, was collapsing, taking with it the ancient cottonwood that anchored the fence to the lower pasture. And near it, paralyzed by fear, stood Elspeth, who had followed her father out into the storm. The bank gave way with a sickening roar. The massive tree tilted, its roots tearing from the earth, its trunk swinging down toward the child. Silas screamed her name and ran, but he was too far. Mei Lin was closer. She did not hesitate. She launched herself forward, her powerful body moving with shocking speed. She reached the collapsing fence line just as the main trunk began to fall. She couldn't stop it, but she caught a thick, heavy branch, a piece of the tree that would have crushed the girl. She braced her feet, digging them into the slick mud, and took the full, crushing weight of it onto her shoulders and back. The impact drove her to her knees, but she did not fall. Her muscles screamed, her bones grated, but she held. It was a singular act of impossible strength, a dam of flesh and bone against the flood's fury. Silas snatched Elspeth, pulling her back to safety. He turned back to Mei Lin, his face white with terror and awe. She was still there, on her knees in the churning water, holding the weight of the world, it seemed, on her back. Jedediah appeared, his face grim, and together the two men used pry bars to lever the branch just enough for her to get clear. She staggered out of the water, bruised and shaking, mud-caked and bleeding from a dozen scrapes. The adrenaline faded, leaving a deep, trembling exhaustion. They stood in the abating rain, the roar of the flood filling the air. Silas looked at his daughter, safe and sobbing in his arms. Then he looked at Mei Lin. He saw the raw, bleeding gouges on her shoulder where the bark had torn her skin. He saw the way she held herself, trying to hide the pain. He stepped toward her, his face working with emotions he had no words for. He reached out and put a hand on her arm. It was not a casual touch. It was firm, warm, and full of a desperate, overwhelming gratitude. His thumb stroked the back of her arm, a small grounding motion in the chaos. It was the first time he had touched her with anything like tenderness. In that touch, a silent promise was made, a bond deeper than any contract was sealed. Her armor, for just a moment, felt a little less heavy. Abernathy, realizing his trap had not yet sprung, shifted his tactics. If he could not break Silas financially, he would break him socially. He began to whisper in the town's quiet corners. The whispers were poison. He spoke of the strange, oversized Chinese woman at the Alkali Creek Ranch. He hinted at an unseemly arrangement, a grieving man taken advantage of. He painted Mei Lin as a usurper, a witch, a woman of loose morals whose influence over the motherless child was unnatural. The rumors spread like fire through dry grass, fanned by fear and prejudice. The whispers reached the ears of Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife. She was the arbiter of the town's conscience, a woman whose righteousness was forged in her own private sorrow. Years ago, she had lost her only son to a winter fever, and the loss had encased her heart in a brittle shell of moral certainty. Provoked by Abernathy's careful words about protecting the innocent, she gathered 2 other women from the church sewing circle and rode out to the ranch in her husband's best buggy. She found Mei Lin on the porch, mending one of Elspeth's dresses. Elspeth herself was sitting nearby, carefully arranging pebbles into a pattern. Mrs. Gable marched up the steps, her face set in grim determination. "We have come," she announced, her voice ringing with authority, "to speak with Mr. Miller about the welfare of his child. It is not right, this situation. It is not decent." Mei Lin did not rise. She did not bristle at the accusation. She looked up from her sewing, her eyes meeting Mrs. Gable's. Her face was still, but there was no wall there, only a deep, sorrowful calm. She looked at the woman, and she saw not an attacker, but a fellow traveler in the land of grief. "You are Mrs. Gable," Mei Lin said, her voice soft. "You lost your boy, Thomas. He was 7. The statement, so simple and so personal, struck Mrs. Gable like a physical blow. Her righteous anger faltered. How did you know that?" she stammered. "I have seen the way you look at the schoolboys in town," Mei Lin said gently. "I have seen the hollow place he left behind. You know what a quiet house sounds like after a child is gone. I am only trying to fill a small piece of the quiet for Elspeth. I am trying to mend what is torn. You, of all people, must understand what it is to mend." She held up the small dress, the tiny, careful stitches she was making. She did not defend her morals or her place in the house. She spoke only of a shared and profound human experience, the loss of a child, and the desperate, holy work of patching up the world for those who remain. Mrs. Gable stood frozen. The 2 women with her shifted uncomfortably. In Mei Lin's quiet empathy, the townswoman's armor of judgment cracked. She saw not a foreign usurper, but a woman who understood her deepest wound. She looked at Elspeth, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes, not fearful ones. She saw the neatly patched fences, the healthy garden, the clean porch. She saw not a place of sin, but a place of healing. Without another word, she turned, her face pale and shaken, and led her delegation back to the buggy. Her certainty had been replaced by a troubling, transformative doubt. The final confrontation came on the last day of the month. Abernathy, his patience gone, called in the final note. He posted notices for a foreclosure auction to be held on the steps of his own bank. It was a public execution designed to humiliate Silas and establish Abernathy's absolute power. The entire town gathered, a somber, curious crowd in the dusty square. Abernathy stood on the top step, dressed in his funereal best. He made a speech, his voice dripping with false regret. He spoke of his friendship with Silas's family, of his own broken heart at this unfortunate but necessary business. He was a pillar of the community, a benevolent shepherd forced to cull a sick sheep from the flock. The auctioneer, a nervous man in Abernathy's employ, cleared his throat to begin, and then a space opened in the crowd. Mei Lin stepped forward. She was dressed in her clean but plain bombazine. In her hands, she held the ranch ledger. She walked to the bottom step and turned to face the town. "Before you sell this man's home," she said, her voice clear and caring in the silence, "you should know the price he has already paid." Abernathy's smile tightened. "This is a private matter, madam. It does not concern you. It concerns justice, Mei Lin replied calmly, and she opened the book. In a steady, unwavering voice, she began to read. She did not interpret or accuse. She simply read the facts. She read the dates and the figures. She read the interest rates that doubled in the night. She read the service fees for services never rendered. She read aloud the fine print clause in the water rights contract, the one that gave Abernathy the spring, the lifeblood of the entire valley, for the price of a single missed payment. She had made copies of the land grants from the county office, and she held them up, showing the survey lines, proving that Abernathy knew the spring's true value all along. She laid the entire fraudulent scheme bare, piece by piece, with the cold, irrefutable power of his own bookkeeping. The crowd murmured, the sound growing from a hum to a roar of indignation. Abernathy's trowel smile cracked and fell away, revealing the ugly, snarling face beneath. "Lies!" he shrieked, his composure shattering. "The ravings of a conniving foreign—" He stopped, but the ugly word hung in the air, damning him more than any ledger. At that moment, a figure stepped out from the crowd and stood beside Mei Lin. It was Mrs. Gable. Her face was calm and resolute. "I believe her," she said, her voice ringing with the moral authority she had once tried to wield against Mei Lin. Then another figure pushed through. Jedediah, his one arm held stiffly at his side. "She speaks true," he growled. One by one, others who had been helped by Silas in the past, who had felt the squeeze of Abernathy's rates, stepped forward. The town which had come to watch a man be ruined had instead rallied to save him. Abernathy stood alone on the steps, his power broken, his true nature exposed to the light. He was finished. 2 years passed, 2 cycles of seasons that washed the dust and bitterness from the land. The Alkali Creek Ranch was no longer a place of sorrow. It was a show place, a testament to hard work and clever planning. The house was painted a cheerful white. The fences were taut and strong. The cattle were fat and numerous, and the irrigated pastures were a shock of brilliant green against the dun-colored hills. The spring, now legally secured, ran clear and cold. Mei Lin was the undisputed heart of the place. She was no longer just a worker, she was its architect, its strategist, its soul. Elspeth, now a chattering, confident girl of 8, was her constant shadow, her hand often tucked securely into Mei Lin's larger one. Jedediah took his orders from her without question, his grunts of "seen worse" having slowly evolved into grudging admissions of "good thinking, Lin." Mrs. Gable was a weekly visitor, bringing pies and town gossip, their friendship a quiet, sturdy thing built on a foundation of shared understanding. They were a family forged not by blood, but by shared crisis and mutual respect. One evening, in the long gold light of late summer, Mei Lin sat on the rebuilt porch, watching the last of the sun's rays paint the clouds in hues of rose and apricot. Silas came and sat beside her, not on the steps as he once had, but in the chair next to hers. For a long time they sat in a comfortable silence, the silence of people who no longer needed words to understand one another. Finally he spoke, his voice slow and deliberate, as if he had been practicing the words for a long time. "When you first came here," he began, "I just saw a pair of strong hands. I was so lost I couldn't see anything else. I expected you to do a man's work and then be gone." He paused, looking out at the thriving land before them. "But you did more than that. You fixed the gate. You healed my daughter's silence. You faced down Jedediah's pride. You saved Elspeth's life in the flood. You saved this ranch on the bank steps. You saved me." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of a gentle, wondering light. "The world looked at you and saw something. Too much. Too big. Too strong. Too plain. Abernathy called you substantial, like you were a piece of lumber. They were all fools. Your bigness held up a falling tree. Your strength rebuilt this home. Your stubborn, quiet plainness held a truth they couldn't bear to see. Your too-muchness. Mei Lin, it was just enough to save us all." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a new deed. He opened it and laid it on the small table between them. "I don't want to be your employer," he said, "and I don't want to own you. I want to be your partner, in all of it. This place, it's as much yours as it is mine. I want your name here. right next to mine. If you'll have it, if you'll have me. Mei Lin looked at the deed. She looked at the thriving ranch, the home she had rebuilt with her own hands and heart. She looked at this good, quiet man who had finally learned to see her, and she felt something inside her, a great ancient weight, begin to shift. The old armor, the fortress built from a lifetime of hurt and misunderstanding, the heavy shield of her still face, it did not shatter. It simply dissolved like mist in the morning sun, leaving not a wound, but a quiet, open space. All the pain of being too much, all the loneliness of being unseen, it all washed away in the long gold light of that evening. She felt for the first time in her life, perfectly, completely enough. She turned to Silas, and a small, true smile touched her lips. Yes,